Hey guys, hoping all is well with everybody. In this video, we're going to be continuing the read-along of The Secret Zoo by Brian Chick. And the last time we finished, we completed chapter 39, so today we'll be starting with chapter 40. But as always, please feel free to follow along, and I'll be showing you any pictures as we come across them. Chapter 40, Bhanu, Larchman, and Mr. DeGraff. Magic, Alice said in a soft, dreamy tone that made the word come out like a song. She aimed her glassy stare at the ceiling and seemed to consider the possibilities. Richie was more direct in sharing his feelings. Totally cool. Mr. Darby fell into his seat with a sigh. Most of the hummingbirds settled back into the trees. Beside Noah, a green hummingbird paused to sip from a flower cup, hovering in the air as if suspended by invisible strings. The scouts' animal friends were playing in the green underbrush. Blizzard was waving his head between giant flowers and burying his snout in pink petals. Dozens of hummingbirds had perched along his back. They looked like colorful bows in his thick white fur. At Blizzard's side was Podgy. A hummingbird had settled on his head, and he was waddling around, trying to shake it off. Above them, Dodie and Marlowe swooped through the trees, chasing a rainbow-colored cluster of hummingbirds. Mr. Darby combed his bushy gray beard with his fingers and continued his story where he had left off. He instructed his crews to construct something to replace the cages. Mr. Jackson wanted something more, and he, or his madness, insisted there was a way. Unfortunately, no one had any idea that wasn't based on extending the walls of the cages. This was not good enough for Mr. Jackson. The crew leaders were baffled. No one could understand what Mr. Jackson wanted. Most of them believed that the poor man had completely lost his mind, and they tried to ignore him, but he wouldn't give up. He knew he could do something. He just didn't know what it was. 3 months later, Mr. Jackson finally found what he was searching for. Mr. Darby reached into his purple trench coat and pulled out an old leather-bound book. This is one of Mr. Jackson's diaries. It's normally kept in the library of the Secret Society. But... The Secret Society? Noah interrupted. What's that? The Secret Society? Why, that's us. Tank, myself, Blizzard, Podgy, Dodie, Marlowe, every hummingbird and hummingbird hideout, and many people and animals that you have yet to meet. Mr. Darby paused. Then he added, perhaps the three of you are part of the Secret Society now, too. Us? Richie said. Secret Society? Cool, said Ella. Fate has selected you, Mr. Darby said. Ella tried to speak, but Mr. Darby held up his palm to stop her. Let me continue. The old man opened his book and began to read. I was home alone when I heard the knock. I was home alone when I heard the knock. I crossed the foyer and opened the front door. Standing on a porch was a pale young man. At first glance, I actually believed him to be a ghost, a man of spirit, dead many years, and no longer a body of flesh and blood. I feared the worst. I feared that I had died and that this creature were here to guide me to the world beyond. After standing in shock for a moment, I asked, What do you want? The peculiar man slid his wet hands together and said, A minute of your time. Though he was terribly strange, I couldn't let him stand on the porch in the cold rain. I showed him indoors. I made a pot of tea, and we sat down in my study. After some time, the man said, My name is Mr. DeGraff, and he held out his hand. His skin was sickly yellow. His nails were like claws. With great reluctance, I shook his hand. Mr. DeGraff stood and wandered to a bookshelf. He stroked the bindings with his ugly fingers, reading the titles as he moved. Do you enjoy reading, Mr. DeGraff? I asked. Not at all, he answered, keeping his eyes fixed on the books. I hate reading. Words bore me. They're pretty and sad. I'm a man of action. He changed the topic. I understand you have, about 117 pets that you don't know what to do with. I was about to reply, but Mr. DeGraff spoke first. But I know, Mr. Jackson. I know what to do with them. I couldn't help being intrigued. Explain yourself, I said, but do so quickly, because this conversation is growing foolish. Mr. DeGraff would not be rushed. He continued to slither along the bookshelves, dragging his pallid finger across the spines. When he spoke again, it was only to say, I'll talk when I'm ready to talk. I felt my face flush with anger. I pointed toward the door and shouted, Mr. DeGraff, you are invited to leave, sir. Unbothered, Mr. DeGraff shrugged and glided toward the door, saying, I'm sorry. Sorry for you, that is. I couldn't restrain my curiosity. I grabbed hold of the strange man and said, You have 2 minutes. 2 minutes. If you cannot figure out what you want to say by then, I'll happily return you to the storm. Mr. DeGraff smiled a black, nearly toothless grin. He walked back into the room and said, I know a way that you can return your pets to the wild without returning them to the wild. And how is that? You simply increase their space. That's all the wild is, anyway. Space. I laughed and said, That's it? That's how you can solve my problems. No, said Mr. DeGraff. He buried his fingers in his pocket and pulled out a wrinkled slip of paper. He looked deeply in my eyes, as if trying to communicate with his own. This, he said, this is how I can solve your problems. I snatched the paper and read it. On it was a name, Bhanu Lakshman, and below that the name of a city in India. This man, Mr. DeGraff said, was born under exceptional circumstances, and as a result he can accomplish exceptional things. Some claim that he is skilled in magic. He is the one you need to see. What? You're insane, I declared. But Mr. DeGraff was done with the conversation. He was already on his way to the front door. This is ludicrous, I shouted. You come here with stories of magic and... Mr. DeGraff wrapped his yellow fingers around the doorknob and stopped. Without looking back, he flatly stated, Mr. Jackson, our time together has come to an end. The strange man stepped out of the door and crept into the dark, rainy night. I stood in the empty foyer and read the name a second time. Bhanu Lakshman. Wait a minute! I roared. Mr. DeGraff! I ran to the door and threw it open, but the man was gone. It was as if he'd been taken by the night. Taken, in fact, by the shadows. Mr. Darby paused. Ella asked, Did Mr. Jackson go to India? Yes, Mr. Darby said. He did. And he found Bhanu? It took some time, some seeking, but he did find Bhanu. Then what happened? Mr. Darby resituated his sunglasses on his nose and continued to read. After several months, I discovered Bhanu Lakshman in North India. He had kind, dark eyes, neatly clipped hair, and flowing Indian garb. He carried his chin high, his shoulders back. I explained that I had traveled a long way and wanted only a moment of his time. Bhanu agreed, and I told my story. Bhanu sat and listened, occasionally sipping his tea but saying nothing. As I spoke, his penetrating stare seemed to look inside me more than upon me. When I finished, he asked, And what, my friend, do you expect of me? I've traveled a long way. Someone, a person I don't know, said you have supernatural talents, magical abilities. He said you could help me create something for the animals. Bhanu smiled. With all your money and machines, you cannot create something yourself? No, I cannot, I said. Bhanu said, India is my home, my friend. America lies a great distance from my home. He paused and faced me squarely. His stare was piercing. It was as if he could see something in my eyes, my past, my pain, my hope. After a long time, he said, Perhaps I can do things, but there are limits to my gifts. You should know this before we begin. You should also know that I will need my brothers. Without them, with our physical bond, there are no magical abilities, as you said. Your brothers? I asked. Yes, I have 2 identical brothers. They will have to join me in my adventure to America. They will be needed. You're one of the 3? Yes, triplets. But we're not born of the same mother. What? Kavi, Vishal, and I were born of different mothers in different cities. That's impossible. What is more remarkable is that my brothers and I were born at exactly the same moment, weighing exactly the same amount, and measuring exactly the same length, and our mothers all bore the same name, Kavita. I was too stunned and confused to speak. We will help you, Mr. Jackson. We will help you because I believe the work of the gods has brought us together, across such a vast distance, so that I may help you, and you may help me. Help you? Help you how? I'm afraid I must attach to my offering one condition. Go ahead. Bhanu told me. I quickly agreed. Chapter 41. Magic and Machines. Hummingbirds continued to buzz around Mr. Darby. They landed on him as if he were a statue in a fountain. He closed the diary, set it aside, and said to the scouts, "The 4 men left for America the following week." "But what did Bhanu want?" Richie asked. "He said he wanted something. What was it?" The old man looked into space and contemplated something. A minute later he said, "I don't know how to say this without just saying it. I've told you of the secret society. Now let me explain it. The secret society is a band of humans and animals that has existed since the dawn of the first day. It is devoted to protecting animals, especially those that are threatened by humankind." "Those in danger of extinction?" Ella asked. "Yes," Mr. Darby said. "Hold on," Noah said. "This explains the dodo birds. You guys saved them from dying off, right?" "Yes," Mr. Darby said. "Hundreds of years ago, a Dutch sailor, one of us, saw what was happening to the dodos. He rescued several and hid them in a secluded part of the island that the ship had landed on. Weeks later, he managed to escape with the birds. Thus, he rescued the species." "But the secret zoo wasn't built until many years later," Ella pointed out. "How did he protect the dodos for that long?" Though the secret society once operated in isolated groups, the members were very effective. The Earth has ways to conceal the truth, and the secret society found them. Caverns, forests, mountains, and deserts. Each has a bounty of hiding places. The independent groups of the secret society grew larger and larger. Concerns about their geographic separation began to surface. Bhanu happened to be a member of the secret society, and what he wanted in exchange for helping Mr. Jackson was a place where everyone could come together in an organized fashion. This place would also ensure the safety of the animals. "So Bhanu and his brothers built the secret zoo?" Noah asked. "Yes, but not without help." "Help?" "The help of Mr. Jackson. But more important than that, the help of his construction crews. Together, using magic and machines, they dug into the earth and opened the sky." Richie's mouth dropped, and Ella's eyes widened. "I don't get it," Noah said. Mr. Jackson's construction crews tunneled into the ground. As they did so, Bhanu and his brothers gave light and air and sky and stars to the caverns. Bhanu and his brothers put the elements of the world into the holes and tunnels. "But I saw Arctic Town," Noah said. "There's no simple hole in the ground. It's enormous. I mean, look how big this birdhouse is." The brothers could expand space. They could take a hole and make it 1,000 times its size. "But first they needed the hole," Ella called out. "That's where the construction guys came in. The larger the hole, the larger the space the brothers could create." "Something like that," Mr. Darby said. He scratched his unkempt gray beard and added, "But it was more difficult than that." "How?" Noah asked. Mr. Darby said, "Let's go for a walk. Some fresh air will help us. Besides," the old man added with a smile, "we have urgent business to tend to." Chapter 42. Back at the City of Species. Mr. Darby led through Hummingbird Hideout and across the Forest of Flight. They crossed a bridge over a river and that led them to the small island in the middle of the water. On the island was a giant elevator made of glass. The walls, the floor, and the ceiling. Attached to the outside of the floor and the ceiling were the mechanics, gears, pulleys, cables, and other unnameable pieces. Mr. Darby, the scouts, Tank, and the animals were able to fit inside. As the elevator ascended into the fog, Ella asked, "Is this thing magic?" "Not at all," Mr. Darby replied. "This elevator was built about 50 years ago by a brilliant young team of engineers. Kids not much older than you, in fact." Noah observed the view as they climbed through the monstrous tree limbs. "Where are they now?" Tank answered this time. "Most of them retired and live in Senior City." "Where's that?" Richie said. "On the outskirts of the City of Species," Tank said. His deep voice boomed and echoed off the elevator walls. "It's a little place, more like a town than a city. Most of us live here in the Cities of Species." "How many people are in the secret society?" Ella asked. Tank looked at Mr. Darby and said, "How many are we now? 1,000? 952, the last time I checked," said Mr. Darby. 952? Noah gasped. "And they all live here?" "Most of them do," Mr. Darby said. "Some are crossers." "Crossers?" Noah asked. "Those who cross between the secret zoo and the outside world. Some of them even have lives on the outside." The elevator climbed through the fog and into the open space above, where the scouts saw a host of birds. Many of them chased the glass box and flew circles around it. Some perched on the roof, hitching a ride into the heights of the forest of flight. To Noah it seemed that the birds were happy that Mr. Darby had found the action scouts. The elevator stopped beside an enormous branch. It shifted upward and crossed the branch as giant gears and pulleys worked the cables. It snapped into place between thick rails built between the tree limbs. They reminded Noah of rails he'd seen in subway stations. From there, the elevator rocketed ahead, breaking twigs and frightening birds into the air, and stopped at a narrow, dark hallway built into the wall of the forest of flight. The elevator door opened, the group exited, and at the end of the hallway, Mr. Darby flung open a velvet curtain, revealing the city. With a sweep of his arms, the old man said, "Here we are, back in the City of Species." The scouts ducked beneath a waterfall and hopped over a stream to reach the city streets, which were still packed with animals. A panda bear pranced up to Ella. "Hey, big fella," she said. The panda playfully nudged its head against her and scampered off. "See that, Richie?" Ella said. "You're not the only popular person around here." "Speaking of that," Richie said as he pointed across the road, "look who's coming." A small band of prairie dogs charged across the street, heading straight for Richie. They scurried around his feet in circles and stared at his heels. Richie tiptoed through the jittery little herd, trying not to squash any of them. Mr. Darby noticed the commotion and bellowed an encouraging laugh. "I see you have even more companions, yes?" One of the prairie dogs, a chubby critter with a face as round and large as a softball, had taken a special liking to Richie. He bounced at his side, staring up at him. "What's the deal with this one?" Richie asked. "That's P-Dog," Tank said. "P-Dog?" Richie said. "Let me guess. The P stands for prairie." "They all have names, right?" Ella asked. "Like the hummingbirds." "Yep," Tank said. "That's P-Dog. And over there is Hot Dog. And let me see. That's Chili Dog and Nibbles and Dog Tag." "Mr. Darby," Richie said, "can all the animals at City Zoo get to the secret zoo? You know, the way the prairie dogs did?" "Absolutely. But how is that possible?" "Through 100 years of magic and machines, we never stop building, we never stop imagining, and we never stop creating. Bhanu's magic is still alive in the secret zoo, and we never stop using it." Richie said, "The sectors, all the doorways with those velvet curtains. I don't see how—" "Each sector has a habitat that's suitable for any number of species. All the cages in the city zoo have a passage to at least one sector, and every sector has a passage to the City of Species. From what I've heard, Noah came through a sector via a passage from Penguin Palace. You and Ella came through a sector that's connected to Little Dogs of the Prairie." Ella said, "You mean all the exhibits at the zoo are connected to this place?" "Yes. On top of that, many exhibits at the city zoo even have secret accesses into the outside world. That's how Blizzard got into the tunnel," Richie said. "But why do they need access to the outside world?" "They patrol." "They what?" "They patrol. They patrol the secret zoo and its perimeter." Noah said, "That explains the monkeys that Megan saw on the rooftops in our neighborhood." Richie said, "But what are they patrolling for?" Mr. Darby looked at the sky and combed his fingers through his beard for several moments. Then he turned his eyes back to Richie. "I think that conversation will be best saved for later." More and more animals gathered in the City of Species. They were pushing through the sector curtains and piling into the streets. "What's going on?" Noah asked. "You're about to see," Mr. Darby said. The old man paused and added, "Now is the time to tell you what we know about Megan, but I must warn you that the story might be difficult to hear." "We can take it," Ella assured him. An ostrich stopped to peck at something in the street. Ella jumped to dodge its fat feathered rump. Mr. Darby stopped walking and faced the scouts. "Some of us think Megan might be trapped in a secured area called the Dark Lands." "The Dark Lands," Ella said. "The Dark Lands are a bad place. They are filled with animals, wretched things called Sasquatches. Some believe the Sasquatches—" Mr. Darby paused as if he didn't want to speak his next words. Some believe they have trapped Megan." The warmth drained from Noah's cheeks. He glanced at Ella. She looked strange, almost unreal, like a mannequin that had been made up to look like Ella. Trapped, he whispered. Yes, if she is indeed trapped in the dark lands, the only way to free her is by entering the murky region. Mr. Darby paused and clasped his hands together, and doing that would likely be the greatest trial the Secret Zoo has ever attempted. And I will stop the video there, but I hope you guys enjoyed this video. In our next video, we will be continuing the read along of the Secret Zoo with chapter 43. But as always, I hope you guys take good care of yourselves, and thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thanks.